I have two readings for you this morning. One of them comes from the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama said, "May all great blessings come to those who have an illuminated mind." The Dalai Lama says that all terrible things come to us from those who do not have a disciplined mind. We have, moreover, the statement, "All the fears and the immeasurable suffering that we encounter arise from the mind." The Buddha taught, there is no enemy more powerful than the mind. In all realms of existence, there is nothing more frightful, nothing more to be feared than the mind. Likewise, he said that the disciplined mind gives rise to all excellent qualities. The source and cause of peace and happiness is the mind. Happiness arises from virtuous practice. Suffering arises from negative practice. So happiness and suffering depend on whether or not your mind is transformed or not. Even in the short term, the more you control and discipline your mind, the happier and more relaxed you will be. In contrast to the direct language of the Dalai Lama, we have the rich language of this passage from one of those great works of the English language, the Book of Common Prayer. Give us grace seriously to lay to heart the great dangers we are in by our unhappy divisions. Take away all hatred and prejudice and whatever else may hinder us from godly union and accord. That as there is but one body and one spirit, one hope of our calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, so we may be all of one heart and one soul, united in the holy bond of truth and peace, of faith and charity. And now please open your hymn books to page 102. We are the heirs of noble ages. In our first reading this morning, the Dalai Lama said, the source and cause of peace and happiness is the mind. And the Book of Common Prayer asks God, may we with one mind and one heart glorify Him. So what can we do to apply these words of wisdom to understand our lives and the troubled world we live in? Both the Dalai Lama and the Book of Common Prayer, in their different ways, urge us to move from what they call unhappy divisions to unity. So how can we create unity and thus a better understanding of our troubled world? Since, according to the Dalai Lama, who would argue with him, mind gives rise to all excellent qualities, it is mind that gives us the power to move from divisions to unity. The mind gives us discernment, but the mind without the heart is sterile. The heart gives us empathy, but heart without the mind is limited. However, when we unite the sympathy of the heart with the discernment of the mind, we achieve great synergistic power. We achieve the power of understanding. And it is through the power of understanding that we can overcome the doctrinal divisions that we all heard about when we were growing up. You know what these are. We all learned that the Baptists were different from the Methodists are different from the Presbyterians are different from the Lutherans, all Protestant denominations are different from the Catholics, and all Christian denominations believe something different from what the Jews believe. Right? That's basically the way it grows up. That's the history of religion for many people. In the spirit of Unitarian Universalism this morning, I propose to transcend all of these doctrinal differences. I propose to say that there's a way to understand Western religions completely without regard to doctrine and understand the one lasting distinction that transcends all doctrinal differences. What I have in mind is the distinction in the way the religions treat the Word and the image. Now, to understand how this began, we begin with the geography of the Mediterranean, which basically has one bank and another bank. On one bank we have Spain, France, Italy, and Greece. On the other bank we have what we now call the Middle East, Israel, but also Egypt, Syria, Morocco, those countries. Now, it was on this bank of the Mediterranean that Moses stood on a mountaintop, as Michelle so charmingly told us, some 1,000 years ago and received the tablets on which God inscribed the Ten Commandments. Now, what interests us is precisely the breaking of the Ten Commandments. Remember what the Israelites were doing when Moses came down from the mountain. They were dancing around the fire. They were dancing specifically in front of the calf, which was to say a cult image, an image that was important to us. In short, they were doing what everybody else in the Mediterranean basin was doing at that time. So we're reading, here's the, shall we say, straight version of what happened when Moses came down from the mountaintop from Exodus 32, verses 19 and 20. When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf of the dancing, his anger burned, and so he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. And they took the calf they had made, burned it in the fire, and he ground it to powder and made the Israelites drink it. Right there in Exodus. This remarkable sequence of events is an essential moment in the development of Western religion. I would go so far as to say this is the very moment when Western civilization as we know it begins, because this is the first recorded instance of the confrontation between the Word on one hand and the image on the other. In such confrontations, which, to repeat, formed Western culture as we know it, the bearers of the Word consistently attack images. Those who believe in the Word define those who believe in the image as other. And they have the belief that this understanding gives them license to attack the other. So, when Moses ground the golden calf in powder, dissolved the powdered water, and made the Israelites drink it, this act began a new era of confrontation. It signaled a fundamental change in the very concept of religion, first locally, in this particular area, and then in the Western world as a whole. Now think about this. In the future, there would be dancing on one bank of the Mediterranean where Greece and Italy were. There would be goddesses on one bank of the Mediterranean. On the other bank, where Moses brought down the Ten Commandments from the Gospel, from the God, there would be only men writing books. It was on this bank that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were all created. This group of three religions constituted a radical departure from all the religions that had ever existed in the world before. They were monotheistic, they were text-based, and they emphasized patriarchal authority. These were the first religions in the history of the world that had that particular combination of characteristics. And it is the spread of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that created the modern world as we know it. As a test case of the spread of Christianity, let's consider the case of Ephesus, which is a major Greco-Roman town. Ephesus was famous for the temple of Artemis, which is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And around the year 53, 54, something like that, the Apostle Paul came to Ephesus and he began preaching. We don't know exactly what he was saying, of course, but we are pretty sure that it was an exposition of John 1:1. And if you look at the cover of your order of service, you will see John 1:1 printed there, one of the most famous verses in the Bible. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. This is a key assertion of the primacy of the Word over the image, and it was precisely Paul's preaching of the primacy of the Word over the image that led to the second major confrontation between the Word and the image that we know about. Now, in order to understand this confrontation, let's restore a little bit the social context of Ephesus. Remember the temple of Artemis? Great temple. There were silversmiths in the area who were making silver statues. They were making cult statues of Artemis to give to the people who came there and worshiped. And they immediately sensed, the silversmiths did, that Paul's advocacy of the Word constituted a threat to their livelihood. Now, before I go any further, let me point out that what I'm talking about here is something that you may never have heard about. Raise your hands if you've ever heard people talk about the economic consequences of the spread of Christianity. This is not what people generally talk about. People generally talk about sin, salvation, doctrine, and all the rest of it. But today, we want to understand these economic consequences of the spread of Christianity because it had a very important ripple effect. The silversmiths gathered in the magnificent 50,000-seat theater in Ephesus. It still stands. And it's right in front of the Agora, our public meeting place, where Paul was preaching. So here's what happened. Read now from Acts 18:24 through 29. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in no little business for the craftsmen. And he called them together along the workmen with in related trades and said, "Men, you know we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in Asia and the world. If this continues, the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty." And when they heard this, they began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And soon the whole city was in an uproar. Ultimately, of course, you know how this ended. The silversmiths were defeated. Artemis was defeated because the word triumphed over the image when Emperor Constantine was converted to Christianity. So the Christians began doing what Moses had done. They began doing what believers in the Word usually do. They began attacking images which they defined as other. One well-known example of the Christians' attack on images is a very famous statue. It's the Winged Victory of Samothrace. It's an enormous statue. It sits in a very prominent place in the Louvre Museum. If you have been to the Louvre, you may have seen pictures of it somewhere. This is a magnificent statue. It's one of the most famous in classical antiquity, and it has no head. Why doesn't it have a head? Not because it was broken off or it fell off. What happened was that the Christians knew and feared the power of the goddess, so they saw her head. And it wasn't just the Winged Victory of Samothrace. The Christians sawed off the heads of all the statues from Greek and Rome that they could find. As a result, if you go to museums these days that have a classical collection, you'll probably see some headless statues. And they're the results of the Christians' attack on images which they found threatening. I mention that in part to remind you that the videos of the ISIS terrorists beheading people, which we're also horrified about, are simply one example of doing something that has a long history in the Middle East. Now, there's a curious thing that happened when Christianity moved to Italy. When Christianity moved to Italy, the overwhelming power of the tradition of the visual arts in Italy, both statuary and paintings, overwhelmed the doctrine of the mind and essentially converted Christianity to a religion of the image, and this is why the world's greatest artist, Michelangelo, created the world's greatest painting, ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the early 16th century. However, this is something like an ultimate expression of the religion of the image, and when something reaches an ultimate expression, it usually means that a counter movement is about to set in, and that counter movement was embodied by an unknown German monk. This, of course, was Martin Luther. Did you know that Luther was visiting Rome precisely at the time when Michelangelo was working on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel? It's as though both the expression of the religion of the image and the reversal of the expression of the image were right in Rome at the same time. So, the thing is, Luther came from Germany, which had a minimal visual tradition, so he was accustomed to experiencing words, not images. And these images seem strange and foreign and unchristian. Moreover, it was, of course, at this time that Johannes Gutenberg had also done something essential, namely creating the printed press. And if you know about the printed press, you realize, of course, that it was possible, because of the printed press, to spread in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, much more rapidly into many more people than Paul could ever do when he was preaching. So we conclude that all the Protestant denominations that you're familiar with, Lutherans, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, all that, were all created in effect by Gutenberg's printing press. So we find the same thing happening. Very predictably, we find that the Christians began attacking images. Take the case of the English town of Stratford-on-Avon, for example. Militant Protestants partially whitewashed the paintings in the town's chapel in order to obliterate them. As it happens, the whitewashing was supervised by the head alderman. His name was John Shakespeare. You may have heard of John Shakespeare's son William. And it's now clear that Shakespeare's genius was aided and abetted, so to speak, by the rising primacy of the word in England. This is when the word in England, the English language, came into its own. It's not coincidental that the King James Bible first appeared in 1611, which is the year when Shakespeare wrote his play The Tempest. Historically then, Protestantism is a religion of the book, and Catholicism is a religion of the image. That is why to this day it's usually true that Protestant churches do not have paintings and crucifixes, whereas Catholic churches usually do have paintings and crucifixes. But enough about Europe. What about America? What happened to the word in America? Well, when the Puritans came to America, they usually brought one cultural artifact with them, and they thought that was enough. They brought the Bible. And once again, if you look at the cover of your order of service, you'll see what the Geneva Bible looked like. This was the one book that the Puritans brought with them. In the wilderness of North America, far from Catholic churches that were decorated with images, far from churches that had statues, the Puritans created the most verbal religion the world had ever known. There's a lot more to be said about the Puritans, but for the moment, I want to borrow a phrase from Bob Dylan and bring it all back home. I'd like to talk about religion and the word in my hometown of Tupelo, Mississippi. If the Puritans created a verbal religion in America, and they did, the Scots-Irish people who settled the South intensified the American Christians' already strong emphasis on the primacy of the word. The Scots-Irish people had no visual tradition to speak of, and as a result, the South as a whole has no visual tradition. In the South, words matter. Images don't matter. For example, why do you think it is that Southerners believe that the Bible is literally true? When verbal people, like the Southerners, read the Bible, they find no metaphors, and they certainly find no myths. They find words. So in keeping with the cultural logic of the South, Southerners find no words in the Bible, and therefore they believe that the Bible is literally true. This belief in the primacy of the word explains a great deal about the South. Moreover, this cultural logic, as I call it, because it's not confined to any one person or any small group of people, this cultural logic is all the more powerful because it operates unconsciously, and as a result, no one can talk about it. For that matter, why do you think it is that there are no great Southern painters? Why do you think it is there are no great Southern photographers? Why do you think it is that there are no great paintings that depict the South, whereas we have great paintings that depict every other region of America? Naturally, then, there are lots and lots of artists in the South, but they're artists who work with words. They are writers and singers. And that's why it's important to understand that the two most important white Southerners of the 20th century were both born within a few miles of Harrisburg Baptist Church, which I attended when I was growing up in Tupelo. And those two white Southerners were, of course, William Faulkner and Elvis Presley. This is what the South does. So you can understand, can't you, why it is that Southerners can't deal with things that have no words. Take, for example, the two most important equations in physics. F equals ma, and E equals mc squared. Force equals mass times acceleration. Energy equals mass times the square of the speed of light. There are no words in those equations, and therefore the verbal cultural logic of the South makes people in the South dismiss equations and ultimately science as a whole. It's in this way that we can understand the infamous Scope strike about the teaching of evolution in 1925, and it is also in this way that we can understand the Southerners' vehement opposition to all the science that demonstrates to people like us that climate change is real. To repeat, when we unite the mind and the heart in this way, we don't simply condemn Southerners as anti-intellectual, because to do that is to find them as other. If we unify our hearts and minds, we can understand the cultural logic at work in the South. Science is simply not verbal enough to make sense to people who live in a verbal world. Finally, I want to leave you with a thought about the relationship between the image and the word in religion today. We know that Moses destroyed the golden calf. We know that Christians sawed off the heads of classical statues. We know that Christians obliterated paintings, and that's only the beginning of a long, long list of attacks that Christians made on images of one kind or another. First, Jews did it, then Christians did it, and now it's the turn of Muslims. If we apply the holistic understanding of the mind and heart, we can understand disturbing news stories, for example, rather than simply reacting to them. You may have seen some of the videos of ISIS terrorists who are using sledgehammers and pneumatic drills to attack statues in the museum in the Iranian city of Mosul. Keeping in mind what we know about the relationship between the word and the image in the development of Western religion, and remembering that Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, is a text-based religion, we can say that these ISIS guys feel threatened by images, just as the Jews did, and just as the Christians did in other times. These are examples of the general principle which I offer you today. The bearers of a verbal religion, when it is establishing itself in a community, will consistently attack images. This has happened over and over again, roughly, for the last 3,000 years. So finally, what about you? How does the word and the image and the relationship between the word and the image affect your life? So I leave you with some personal questions. If you have left the religion of your parents, as so many of you have, do you continue the mindset of your parents' verbal religion? Do the visual arts of painting and photography matter to you? Is your own understanding of religion and spirituality purely verbal? Does it always and only involve reading and discussion? Or do sacred images matter to you? And if so, how do they matter to you? So, as Patrick O'Neill used to say, these are some things to think about while you're doing the dishes. And finally, I say thank you for the great privilege of speaking here this morning. Our closing hymn is number 108, My Life Flows On in this song. Please stand as you will.